going to talk about speaker driver and their sonic interaction with rooms, and their limitations and their strengths. You fundamentally have four different driver technologies. You have, for example, on the tweeter, you have dome. The next one you have is horn, which actually is a very old technology. It's not something new. The third one is going to be electrostat, and the fourth being ribbon. And there's variations on the ribbon designs. Now, what a lot of people don't know is that of these four, the oldest one in technology is in fact electrostat. The original electrostatic driver was actually made out of gold leaf and pigskin. And this is going back a long, long time ago. So it's not something new. How it's being done today is very different because historically in the past, the thing that would kill an electrostatic driver is dust and dirt contaminating the surfaces and reducing the efficiency of the driver. Each of these four driver technologies have strengths and weaknesses. There's no such thing as perfect. And what I want to talk about first is its sonic interaction with your room. The dome. The dome is also done in an inverted dome. EPI and Epicure did an inverted dome. But the whole purpose of a dome driver is to have that driver disperse sound in every possible direction equally. It doesn't work out exactly that way, but it has a very wide dispersion, both horizontally and vertical. And the idea behind a dome driver is to flood an environment as much equally as possible. The truth of the matter is that once you get above roughly about 10,000 cycles, the dispersion of a dome driver is less than the diameter of this marker. It's about the size of a pencil, actually. So it's not perfect in dispersion and sound everywhere, but it is very good, giving you a wide range within your room of listening of both horizontal and vertical listening. Now, there still is a preferred listening position, and you'll hear references to sweet spots and things like that in setting up the speakers. That's true. I'm not denying that at all, and it is something we follow. But this is the whole concept behind a dome driver. The horn. Now, you have to understand the beginning foundations of why there were horn drivers, and that was for a long period of time, 5 or 10 watts of power was really a lot, particularly in the 20s and 30s and going forward. So if you wanted to play an acceptable volume and maybe a louder, the only way of effectively doing that is with a horn driver. Now, the way that the horn driver works is you may have a dome within a chassis, and what it does is exponentially explodes the sound and creates a massive amount of power or volume out of a very small surface. You can do this for yourself with just simply take a reasonable sized sheet of paper or a piece of cardboard and roll it into a horn and speak through it. and it's a megaphone. And this is what we're talking about, the exponential explosion of volume. And so the horn has an advantage over a dome tweeter in its ability to produce a significant volume. Depending upon the shape and the material used in the horn, however, you can have artifacts created to these waveforms, which are not desirable. So you have a lot of drivers that are cheaply made, and while they're horns and can explode the sound, they're also not exactly right. Now, one of the other advantages of a horn type design, and Paul Klipsch really capitalized on this, particularly with the bass drivers. Many people may be familiar with the K horn, and in fact, it has a 15-inch woofer in it. But unlike other drivers that try to produce an enormous amount of bass with a massive excursion, Paul instead relied upon the exponential explosion by making a folded horn within his cabinet. Now, why is that important? Well, it's going to stop for a second and look at a driver surface. And so, this is your voice coil and this is your cone. And the biggest enemy of accurate audio reproduction is not what everybody's told. It's not total harmonic distortion. Everybody's gone nuts about this, and you don't hear total harmonic distortion till it reaches about 10%. And so oftentimes you wind up blowing up speakers by the time you hear something going wrong. No, the big problem is what's known as IM, intermodulation distortion. And on a driver surface, where that happens is that in this motion, if it doesn't maintain its shape and winds up, let's say, buckling here and there, what happens is you have surfaces producing information that is not consistent with the signal it should be producing. In other words, it's producing a different pitch, maybe producing it out of time. It's a mess. So you would see these really gargantuan, like Sansui speakers with 15-inch woofers, and the cone surfaces weren't that good. So people played with polypropylene, they played with all sorts of substances, trying to keep this from buckling when it's being propelled by the motor. And what Paul Klipsch said in his design was, I don't need a woofer to move great distances. If I just get it to move a little and I use the exponential of the horn, I'm there. And he was right. So at 120 decibels coming off a K horn, I doubt that his 15-inch woofer even moves 1/8 of an inch. He's trying to avoid the problem of propulsion and a buckling that can start from the motor assembly here. So, if you were to look at a speaker head on, the buckling starts here and then ripples out. So this is why a lot of speakers, particularly with large drivers, don't sound particularly good, because they're not watching out for this problem. But my God, I've got a big woofer and it's got a red dust cap or aluminum foil. It looks great. Well, fine. But there's all jewels and gems and no RPMs to that story. We're after sound. That's what's important. So a horn does things a little bit differently. There's some quality issues you have to watch out for. Dispersion usually on a horn system can be somewhat vertical, but typically it is designed to be far more horizontal. So you'll see horn shapes that are more rectangular with a better flare in these areas than here. And there's also another reason for that is not exactly covered by the technology of a dome tweeter. And we'll get to that right now. I'm moving on to number 4 first, before I go back to number 3 in the electrostats. And I'm going to talk about ribbon and isodynamic designs. And their goal, again, like all the others, is to try to give accurate reproduction. And they do so by embedding in isodynamics or ribbon isodynamics, embedding a surface that they can electronically move. So you'll oftentimes have a magnetic structure, and the current is run through the material to cause it to move. Now, in this approach, is you're dealing with essentially a flat panel. A good example of an absolute true ribbon speaker were the Apaches, which is no longer around. And there are others. But in this flat panel, they have to accept 2 different things in their reproduction. One is that off a flat surface, you basically have a 3-degree vertical dispersion and a 3-degree horizontal. There's trade-offs in this. Number 1 is that if you're the person who likes to roam around, you're going to be missing a lot of information, all right, because it's not being projected at you. So, point dome. However, conversely, the fact that we have controlled dispersion means that we have an ability to really control what's happening in what is being produced. So in the case of 3-degree vertical, well, guess what? If you're sitting there, listening to speakers, and it has a 3-degree vertical, it's not doing what a dome will do, which is to bing it off the ceiling. This is a time delay, which can be very dramatic in its effect. If you've ever been in a gymnasium trying to talk to somebody across a gymnasium, you'll notice you can't understand the words because there's enough delay to the signal that the ear can't focus in on what amplitude it should pay attention to. But as you walk closer and closer together, all of a sudden they become clear. And that's because the human ear is now targeted to the highest amplitude. Well, with dome drivers, the risk you have, depending upon the size and shape of the room and your listening position to a dome, well, you don't get it. You can't figure it out. It's a very confusing message for the brain to figure out. So a flat panel avoids that by having a more direct approach. However, when you have a 3-degree horizontal, that means that your position for the panels and where you sit and listen to is very critical. This is a very fixed sweet spot. And since it's a very fixed sweet spot, guess what? If you have another person who wants to listen, they're not in the sweet spot. And we start adding more people to it, they're not in the sweet spot either. So you have a very beautiful presentation to a single listener. So it has a disadvantage against something that's broad forming, like a dome driver or even a horn. Because the horn will potentially, depending on shape, suffer a little bit of this same problem. But there are trade-offs, okay, in all of this. And like most designs that are flat panel, the other thing you have is limited volume. There's only so much movement that can be provided in a flat panel before it begins to bang against its surfaces. Now, there's one exception to this that I heard with a flat panel, and I'll get to that when I talk about electrostats. And so there are trade-offs in all of these different designs. So it's not only about performance, but also the performance in your home. and you have to think about this before you go wandering off. For God's sakes, a review of any speaker doesn't even begin to address what happens in your home and your listening habits. It may be a great review on a product that really doesn't work for you. You know, there's some great reviews and wonderful tires. Most of them wind up on Formula F1s. They won't work in my 1-ton, okay? They're great tires, just the wrong product. My first love affair with electrostatic loudspeakers started out with the original quads, or people used to think of them as space heaters. A wonderful speaker, very musical. They nailed it. But in their designs, it had a couple limitations. One, it had the dispersion problem. And as we talked about before with flat panel, both vertical and horizontal. And it had another critical one, which is its ability to produce volume. And things went along that range for a long, long time. And then a company named Martin Logan started changing that surface a little. The two people who founded that company, one of them went on to a different direction. I do want to talk about him for a second because he was very enlightening. But what Martin Logan recognized is we can build a panel using more modern technology that doesn't have to be behind some sort of screen or protector to keep dust and dirt from contaminating this surface. I have had other fun stories where the surface got contaminated when somebody spilled a drink on a panel. It was Coca-Cola, actually. And so I can honestly say I'm probably the only person you'll ever meet who took a shower with a Martin Logan panel, because I was at the customer's home and I stripped it out, put the speaker in the shower with me, and I washed it, and then I rinsed it with distilled water very carefully and restored it. So things can happen, but what Martin Logan did was not only that, in other words, freeing up the surface so there's nothing interfering with the dispersion coming off of it. Mind you, in the vertical fashion, it is still a flat panel. So it has those issues of vertical dispersion. But what they changed was going to a curved surface, because the new materials allow them to go to this sort of shape. And what that did, they refer to it as a curvilinear front, is while you still have the 3-degree in the vertical, the horizontal actually went out to 15 degrees. So you had a much wider dispersion side to side. This increases the area of listenership to beyond one person, number one. But number two is a little magic that happens in the home theater, and I'll get there in just a moment. Now, I made a reference to the issues of volume, and Martin Logan's cannot play as loud as a Klipsch. They can't play as loud as a lot of dome driver systems, okay? It's just the nature of the driver system itself. You get about 105, maybe 106 dB of sound pressure. So if you're a Grateful Dead bug crusher, these are not the speakers for you if you're going to play at that type of concert level. They just physically can't do it, nor can most flat panels. They just simply can't do it. That's where the horns come in. That's why they use PA dumps at their own concert. And some dome drivers can do it. Depends upon their quality and what they're built for. Pro sound dome drivers can really do it. I had one customer who dearly loved B&W, and he was playing it so loud, and he asked, when can I turn it up? So we actually wound up getting pro speakers for him because he would have destroyed the B&Ws. And it's not B&W's fault. This guy just loved loud. Now, what I've seen is a flat panel electrostat. Now, going back to flat panel means he has to accept 3 degrees horizontal and 3 degrees vertical but he was getting 120 dB of sound pressure off a flat panel electrostat. So it can be done, but in doing that, you're sacrificing the dispersion angles, and at the same time, when you start making a curvilinear front, you're introducing some other problems that I'm not going to get into. As I said, every driver technology has its trade-offs. But let's take it a little further, as I said, or why I like Martin Logan's, to explain this factor one step further. Now, I'm going to digress for just a moment to help you understand a little bit about these different technologies, because one of the things they're concerned about is what's known as rise time, or how quickly the driver surface will respond to the instruction it receives to move, and to move at a particular frequency. And when you're talking about most panel designs, since they're typically very lightweight, the rise time is fairly good. Electrostats are really the fastest in terms of rise time. However, in compliments to someone who I dearly liked, who's now passed, Jim Thiel, the only speaker that Martin Logan ever asked about was Thiel, because Jim had designed his drivers so well that their rise time was nearly that of an electrostat. And of course, Thiel's could play louder. So, I mean, it was a real viable alternative to an electrostat. And yes, you had the dispersion characteristics that could come off that type of design. So I wanted to just mention this as a footnote. You really don't get this type of technical information in reviews or anything else. This is more scientific. But getting something to respond to the command it's received quickly is essential. Now, what I'm going to talk about are my personal preferences, and that meet my needs. And I think that's really important to keep in mind, that an owner's preference may be based upon what he needs and how he can get to experience it the best. But I'll be honest, when you get into the area of a system that's not only to play music, but also do home theater, I don't think you can do anything better than a Martin Logan. And let me explain. I sat on panels with Tomlinson Holman home theater. It was about 6 or 7 panels at CES about this. And one of the things you want to do in home theater is complement what is happening in the image, the visual image that you're provided with. And what's critical is that your sense of where things are is what's called steering logic. Now, early on in the THX, people tried to control dispersion by putting felt pads around tweeters and all sorts of stuff. Because as we talked about, if you've got a listener and the sound is binging off the ceiling, this disrupts the sense of motion and its location. And one of the reasons I do like the Martin Logans is the fact that I have limited vertical dispersion, 3 degrees, so I'm not dealing with this issue. And I've got 15 degrees that gives me 2 or 3 people are really comfortable listening. And of course, there needs to be literally an electrostatic center channel. I'll digress for a minute. The worst thing you can do, by the way, in setting up a home theater is having different brands of speakers in different locations, because this destroys the steering logic that's going on here. And your hearing is going to be essentially zeroing in on the worst. You know, so if the right and left are worst, your attention span is going to be pulled away from something you maybe hear. Conversely, if this is a disaster, then you're really not picking up when people are off center. And in most movies, you don't have people doing monologues. They're all over the place. And the steering logic has to follow that as well, with the least amount of disruption. And since I'm also after the speed of an electrostat, I'm getting the compliments of that as well. So I can make things fairly terrifying. I did a lot with, let's say, the Forrest Gump movie in the Vietnam scene. I'd scare the shit out of people because it sounded like gunshots whistling past their head, which is not a good sound, trust me. But it's part of the movie, it's part of the experience. But if you have a lot more people, let's say you want to have 2 tiers of seating and people every which way, the Martin Logan isn't going to be ideal for you. You're going to want something that's either horn or a dome driver so that you get more dispersion throughout the room. You may have to resort to things like I have on my ceiling here, where I'm trying to limit when I'm using more traditional speakers from having the sound reflect off the ceiling. Some people may be able to do that, some people maybe not. But your choice of technology and what your goals are relate very much to what driver technology you should consider and look at. Now, mind you, if you're going to try to bug crush in a home theater, again, a curvilinear electrostat has a limitation. Flat panels will have limitation. Ribbons will have limitation as to how loud you can play. That's where you get back into the horns. That's where you get back into dome driver type situations. It depends, but you have to look at this driver technology and what their goals are about, and what they're hoping to achieve with the approach. And this is the basics that I want to give you. It's not an absolute, but as you look at things, think about how they're going to work for you, and whether they're most appropriate or not for the way you live and you want to listen.